On today's World Insight, dire doomsday warnings at the COP26 in Glasgow, with China telling the conference it'll stay the course in meeting carbon targets. Big expectations on COP26 goals.
Good news was needed. Deforestation is a massive issue, but indeed, as with so many of these long-term pledges, it comes down to how we're actually going to implement them.
And Facebook has a new name, Meta. What exactly is the metaverse? How does the metaverse future look like?
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. World leaders are gathering in Glasgow in a bid to ramp up the response to global warming. Over 128 heads of state and government are attending the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP26. Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered a written note. Leaders from India, France, Australia, and the U.S. are among those expected to address the summit in person. The two-week meeting will reveal current action and plans at a time when the world has gone through a series of climate change-related disasters, from severe flooding to wildfires. Dubbed as the most significant climate event since 2015 and the world's best chance to get climate change under control, could this year's COP26, particularly the summit, get everyone on board to building a greener future? For more on the latest COP26, we are now joined in Lisbon, Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue; in Berlin, Michael Melling, Deputy Director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research with MIT; in Beijing, Zhang JIANYU, Executive Director of BRI Green Development Institute. Welcome to all of you. COP26 underway. The leaders from more than 100 countries agree to the end of deforestation. Many say it's significant, others say it's not as much as expected. What's your take, Isabel?
Well, I think, frankly, COP26 needed some good news. You know, we came out of G20 feeling very downbeat because G20 hadn't agreed to end coal, and there was a lot of disappointment expressed by the UN General Secretary. So there was a focus on what people were bringing, what was going to be new. And deforestation is a huge issue, so to have such a clear declaration is very important.
Right.
Enforcement is going to be a major thing, of course.
Always enforcement. Mr. Melling, what about that? The time frame in terms of enforcement, do we see?
Well, I have to echo what Isabel just said. You know, I think good news was needed. Deforestation is a massive issue, but indeed, as with so many of these long-term pledges, it comes down to how we're actually going to implement them. What is the accountability for achieving those targets? And of course, COP26 is not over yet, and I hope to hear more good news over the next 10 days.
When it comes to deforestation, there's the issue of, beyond the national boundary that has to be addressed particularly. JIANYU, tell me more about, do you see from the agreement as to how that is likely to be done?
Yeah, I think deforestation in the technical term sometimes is called REDD or REDD plus. It is not only for its host country, but also has huge implications with regard to two things. One is the regime that we're trying to build, which is the international carbon trading market, that how this will play a role or significant role into that. And the other one is also about trade-related policies. I think we all know that really, if we want to tackle climate change, we need to attack it from all around. And I think trade-related issues has served as a more significant force than it was ever before.
In terms of funding, helping the least developed economies and the emerging economies as well to be able to fund their decarbonized programs. Michael, do you see that is making any progress so far?
It's a difficult issue. Obviously, coming out of the pandemic, it's not as if budgets were full and we weren't facing budget constraints all over in developed countries. But I think it's key, without making progress on that, credible announcements about closing that gap and going beyond the $100 billion per year in the latter half of this decade. I think we won't get the trust that we need between North and South, between the more developed and the less developed economies in the world to progress meaningfully.
So we haven't seen any development and progress being made on that front.
Bits and pieces, but again, the question is how credible. Like, for instance, US President Joe Biden, of course, did pledge to increase significantly the US contribution to international climate finance.
Of $5 billion.
Exactly.
But that still needs to be approved by the Congress, which means it cannot be committed. And the EU has been criticized Washington for giving too little, too late.
Yes. That's as sort of with so many of these issues, there's pledges, there's commitments, there's a lot of announcements. The question is always, again, is the political backing there domestically to follow through after the next election, after the next political change? That's where my concerns are, especially with the US.
100 trillion that is being suggested as the amount, if I remember right, about the deficit in terms of the money needed, financing needed in order to move ahead worldwide on the decarbonized future. JIANYU, how do you see that hole, financing hole, is like to be filled?
Well, I think certainly, again, we need to mobilize the entire community to work on this. I think the pledges from the developed nations to developing countries, the annual $100 billion is just a starting point. Certainly, we'll need a robust and high enough, significant enough carbon pricing so as to mobilize the money from the private sector to go into the financing of all the effort that we need. But also, I want to emphasize, I think a good sign that we're seeing potentially from COP26 is the contribution and the play from the non-state sectors. For example, recently there's an alliance of $5 trillion worth of assets are under some kind of commitment for carbon neutrality, which I think is a really encouraging sign. So again, we need everything, not just the state actors, but also the NGOs, the non-state actors, the companies, everyone.
It's no secret that in the issue of financing, there's a lot of issues about the old money already committed now coming in a different name. It becomes the new money, but actually it is still the old money being committed earlier. So Isabel, do we see much progress really in real terms that's happening?
Well, I really agree with Professor Zhang. The 100 billion, of course, has an enormous symbolic value and particularly important for the atmosphere of the COP. But what really matters is the trillions. And I think that you're going to see a lot more blended finance. I mean, the deforestation pledge that we've seen, for example, comes with $17 billion in a mixture of private and public finance. So what is really important is that we make some progress in lowering the barriers that mean that developing countries have very difficult access to capital. And that's going to be a more creative mixture of public and private finance. Trillions of dollars go into investments all the time, and we've seen the investments in energy shift more and more towards renewable energy, which pays better dividends, which has a future. So I think that if this COP can really give a boost to that, that is what's going to make the difference.
From time to time, we did have some difficulties believing 100% success. So how to adjust, in a way, the expectations?
That's a very good question, Tianwei. So I think we see an increasing asymmetry between the expectations of the public of the electorate, especially the younger voters, in moving forward aggressively on climate change. We have high-level policymakers making bold statements, and yet at the working level, at actually operationalizing these commitments and getting solid policies to get there, it still is lagging behind so badly. And so, indeed, I think, it's a very messy process, and I think expectations have been muted somewhat after COP25 in Madrid, ending somewhat disappointingly with fallout over specific parts of the Paris rulebook. So I'm not terribly optimistic, but I think also expectations have already been set at sort of a, let's see what comes out of this.
JIANYU, how much do you think there's hope for governments to further commit and further implementation plans? How much do you think our hope this time for COP26 will come more from the business and the private sectors?
Well, the Chinese saying is, 千里之行，始于足下. So the long march will only get started from our first step. And I think sometimes symbols and deadlines are important. I think the very fact that, more than 10,000 people get together in the small city of Glasgow in the midst of the pandemic, still negotiating to death about this biggest facing us is really important, and send a signal all throughout the whole world that we need to rise up to this important challenge. Government has played their role. Chinese government has played its role of stopping the financing of coal-fired power plants overseas. That's significant. The $5 trillion asset under management committed to net zero, that's important. I'm here at Tsinghua. They're having a multi-day, non-stop 24-hour conference of the Global University Alliance on Climate Change. That's significant. We just need all of this to add up together.
How should we look at the COP meetings these days, Isabel? Amid a very different environment, certainly there's the pandemic, there is also the geopolitics. Many of the things that we haven't experienced earlier when we talk about the challenge of climate change, earlier when we were gathering together under the banner of UN Climate Change Conference. How should we understand the new circumstances we're in? What does it mean to decision makers at the back of their heads?
Well, it is important. Although I have to say, not every COP, as you said, has been a success, and there have always been big global events that have taken short-term attention away. For example, the financial crisis did, and Copenhagen ended in tears, as we all remember. Paris was a great moment of hope. This is different. We're not negotiating a new agreement. We're trying to show our commitment, or being asked to show our commitment to the agreement that we have already signed and to the pledge and the targets that we have already made. It's a terribly difficult moment for the world. Yesterday, the new figure of direct deaths from COVID-19 reached 5 million. That's, a terrible tragedy. This is the first major gathering of this size since the pandemic began. And I think that for everybody who is in Glasgow, for every government that is there, the expectation, the pressure from public opinion, which is way ahead of leaders in most places, it is very important. And the young people, this is their future. The scientific warnings have never been starker. We know that we have very little time.
It seems that what we have now is not only difficulties for bigger targets and more targets, commitments, but also real implementations of what's already been committed. Michael.
Well, I have to say on that, that I'm actually somewhat optimistic, because if you look at past pledges, whether it's the US NDC adopted, in 2015 ahead of the Paris, whether it's Chinese carbon intensity targets relative to GDP, whether it's the EU's 2020 target for 2020, each of these has actually been achieved, in some cases narrowly, in some cases very easily. And that suggests to me that we underestimate the ability of the private sector, of innovation, etc., to get us towards those targets that seem so far out of reach currently, the longer term, future targets.
Those targets are mainly committed by nations for their own. But what about national targets or commitments to contribute to the international community. That's also another way of looking at it, isn't it, JIANYU?
Definitely. I think we dial back, look at the Paris. We really need to understand the Paris commitment in its entirety, not just NDCs, not just the MCS, the mid-century strategies, not just the wretched commitment, but also very important element of the finance that was committed to the developing nations, the $100 billion. And we know by all accounts, even through a creative accounting, what I call it, is still short, even for that shared number. Tianwei, I agree with you. I think looking at the past is important, but I don't think that should be a reason, excuse to hinder us from moving forward. And I think the global climate crisis just so great that we don't have time. I think the best analogy I heard about this is the dog and the WANG. Well, we're being as the dog, we're trying to run as fast as we can, but the climate crisis as the WANG is running even faster. So even though we're thinking we're making progress, but we are losing in this battle.
I know the urgency. Every one of you have expressed it so vividly in your answers. Before we go, if every one of you could choose a word to share with those who are attending COP26, negotiating under that flag, and those that are watching our discussions, what would that word be, to make things better? Isabel, let's go with you first.
Just one word.
One word.
Work harder.
Michael.
Persistence.
All right. JIANYU.
Say, we need your guys back to negotiate in further negotiations.
You're watching World Insight with me, Tianwei. Still to come, Facebook has a new name, Meta. What exactly is the metaverse? How does the metaverse future look like? Will it help us to solve some of the problems that we're facing right now? Our discussion. Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tianwei. Facebook has a new name, as we know already from last week. The U.S. tech giant is rebranding as it bears plans for delving deeper into the metaverse and shifts its focus on building it. Besides Facebook, other global tech giants such as ByteDance and Sony are vying to dipping into the metaverse. The move will add more competition to an idea that is poised to take off. Big players are riding high as they have been investing heavily in such technologies. So what exactly is the metaverse that they are talking about? How does the metaverse future look like? And how it's likely to impact all of us? Let's get some answers. For more on the metaverse, we are joined in Beijing by HUANG, founding partner of Jadestone Capital and former managing director of Intel China, and Edgar Perez, CEO of MrEdgarPerez.com. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
I'm sure as tech experts, you would love me to ask this question. What would metaverse mean? What kind of beautiful scenarios would it bring to all of us?
I think that for ordinary person to fully appreciate or understand metaverse is watching on the Hollywood movies. There is a new one called Free Guy, and it actually showed in Chinese theater about a month ago. It's a wonderful movie to illustrate what metaverse and can change our life in 10 or 20 years. So basically, we are maybe bridge or merge two worlds, the physical world and versus the virtual world. And right now, most of the time, we're living in the real world. And maybe down the road, we could spend a significant part of life in the virtual world.
Okay.
I don't know if this answers your question or not.
Mr. Perez?
I think for most people, the metaverse will mean expanded experiences, the capability to be able to visit places far away, to meet friends from all over the world in real time, and also in the virtual world, feeling, sensing that the person is almost close to you, hearing you and feeling you. I think that's probably the big impact. And of course, that's going to have an impact not only in our social lives, but also in our work and education environments.
Fascinating concept. Is Facebook going to have quote unquote ownership of it?
I don't think so, the ownership. Of course, and changing the company names from Facebook to Meta actually definitely raised up awareness of metaverse for the every people. So from that perspective, it's a big deal. On the other hand, as we all know, changing a company's name is not sufficient nor necessary condition for any company to transform it from a good company to a great company. So from that perspective, it's not a big deal.
The concept has been there for quite some time. Different investors are taking advantage of the concept as well. So, Mr. Perez, what do you make of the latest change?
Well, when you think about the metaverse, you think about the convergence of our real lives and virtual lives. From that standpoint, there have been already efforts to create metaverses by different companies. What Facebook is trying to do is to create a new infrastructure, a new metaverse. Well, of course, they would like to have some sort of ownership of the platform, and eventually they confirm that with a change of the name to Meta.
There are different concepts flying around. Of course, metaverse is one of the most crucial. But what kind of time frame are we talking about in terms of what metaverse and related technologies would eventually change our lives, Mr. Perez?
That's still the future. So that doesn't exist yet. There are some companies already have individual metaverses, but the promise of the metaverse is actually to have a convergence of all these different metaverses. So people can go through Fortnite to WhatsApp to Facebook and so on without creating new IDs, without changing their IDs. That doesn't exist yet. And I don't think it's going to be present in any way, shape, or form in at least 5 years.
Mr. Huang, though, there are several issues. I think it's as important as probably the concept of metaverse and what it could mean to us in the future, if not more. For example, some of the issues that we have not solved, that is convergence, which Mr. Perez already talked about. We see very different systems established by meta companies around the world. And then we also talk about the privacy issue, the safety and security issue, in which there is no international, shall we say, procedure for a consumer to be able to function. So how do you see all those different questions vis-a-vis the concept of metaverse?
I think the metaverse may be eventually going to change our life in 20 years time frame. So we are still in infancy stage of this total evolution. Technology-wise, you named a few. There's also other technologies, and then this is very similar as iPhone, perhaps. And when iPhone was first come to the smartphone, it's people say it's revolutionary. But you look at the technology iPhone use, hardly to say which one is revolutionary. It's a series of technologies which evolving, and then put them together, become the whole product is revolutionary. So the similar as a metaverse, it has consists of lots of technologies and the AR, VR, computing, AI, etc. And of course, there's a lot of unsolved questions. But we look back to see how the internet has been evolved. In the early infancy, there's a whole bunch of issues, similar as you brought it up. But I think at this early stage, we don't have to have the solution or answers to those issues and questions. All we need is just let it grow, maybe wildly and unregulatedly at the beginning.
But to me, it's interesting because some of the questions that I mentioned already existed at the very early stage of internet birth. And look at where we are today. Of course, some of the problems have been, solved to a certain extent as we went along over the past 2 decades or so. But a lot of them have not been solved. Let's just use Facebook as an example. It's facing tremendous political and legal pressure right now about some of the things that they haven't handled well. For example, personal security, data, and the list goes on. And now we have a new concept, well, a relatively new concept, a lot are enthusiastic about, and yet those earlier and important issues have not been resolved. So my question really is, how would you balance, the curiosity and excitement about developing so-called a bigger area, a new area, vis-a-vis some of the current and most urgent questions that one have to face and give, answers to?
Onus is going to be on the regulators to actually force the companies to move forward in the most precise ways, taking care, of course, of the users' needs.
Okay.
That's as much as the companies will say it's going to be something voluntary. I don't think so. Definitely, companies obviously have a board of directors and shareholders to respond to, and the government will have to act through, of course, regulation or legislation to force the companies to protect the users' information.
All right, Mr. Huang.
I think there's two issues. First of all, metaverse and they are connect or merge and virtual world and with reality, real world. And another one is a lot of these ingredients are built upon the internet. If you look back and then the internet evolution or revolution trajectory, originally the world growth, now it's become a lot more mature. So lots of issues, and you brought it up, it's surfaced. Now it's perhaps we're going to into a more regulation stage for internet as a mature technology and applications. So those and the regulation and challenges is going to have a similar impact to metaverse. In another way, metaverse and before they come into birth, it's already in some more regulated world as compared to the early stage of the internet. So having said that, I don't think we need to worry about metaverse because there's still future.
Yeah.
And at its infancy, we can let it grow a little bit, maybe freely and as wildly as possible. And then by the time it is become the reality, we can worry about the regulation back then.
Yeah.
But the current issues, you brought it up, but the current regulation need on the internet will have an impact to the metaverse.
Thank you so much, Edgar Perez and Jay Huang. Really appreciate it. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.